Well, welcome back to another edition of On Point right here. And of course, this is after the Iowa caucuses. Very cold out there. There was concern whether or not people would turn out. But apparently they did. And here to give us a recap and analysis of what all went on last night and the results this morning is, of course, Eric Ham, political analyst and best-selling author. Eric, run down these numbers. What does this mean? I mean, Trump obviously won. Are the numbers significant in terms of who came in second and third?
No, not at all. They're significant in the fact that Donald Trump certainly beat the spread. It was a record night for him. And we heard during his speech last night after he won that now he's looking to actually coalesce the party around him as the nominee. But Julian, there are two things that I think we should point out from last night, two key takeaways. The first is not to confuse inevitability with invincibility. And what I mean by that is Donald Trump had a big night. He literally won going away. In fact, he won 98 of 99 counties. The only county that was won by someone else was actually Nikki Haley, and she won Johnson County, which is where the University of Iowa is located. And even though she won that county, she only won by literally one vote. So clearly Donald Trump was a dominant candidate last night, and he is certainly going to be the nominee. But I don't think we need to confuse Donald Trump's win and the fact that Donald Trump is going to win most of these contests going away with some level of invincibility that he is actually going to be the president of the United States. Donald Trump is still someone who has 4 criminal indictments with 91 counts hanging over his head. And as we saw yesterday by Joe Biden's record haul and fundraising, where he raised nearly $100 million in one quarter, he still continues to outpace the entire GOP field combined in terms of their fundraising. So yes, Donald Trump had a good night. He had a great night, but he still has a very, very long way to go in terms of what it looks like with him actually securing the White House in November. And
go ahead.
And the second point that I want us to focus on in terms of last night is now all eyes are turning to New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. And Nikki Haley is looking as though she is within striking distance there. But we have to remember that New Hampshire is actually an outlier from other GOP nominating contests. And the reason it's an outlier is because so many independents are allowed to actually vote in that state. So clearly, it looks like she's going to do better, but it doesn't mean she's actually going to stop Donald Trump's march to the White House. To the nomination.
Absolutely. Okay, so it looks like a foregone conclusion that he may be nominated despite anything else that may happen that might prevent that, convictions, whatever, with these 4 indictments and 91 charges that he faces right now going back to court. What I want to focus on a little bit is the mindset of the Republican voters. Here is a guy, a former president, who does have 4 indictments and 91 charges against him, but yet and still, people are still willing to vote for him. And it seems like it might be more than his base. For instance, you have 99 plus counties in Iowa that had caucuses yesterday. I would assume what Trump did not get before in the 2016 election or 2020 were suburban voters, white women, so on and so forth. What did he gain here? What does this overwhelming victory tell you about Iowa that he did not get before?
Well, if we go back to 2016, the last time that Donald Trump participated in the Iowa caucuses, what Donald Trump did last night that he wasn't able to do back in 2016 is he was able to overwhelmingly secure the white evangelical vote. And the white evangelical vote actually is the dominant subset of the Republican Party. And Donald Trump is actually winning that vote in droves right now. Mm-hmm. And that is actually the difference between this year and 2016.
70% of the people, depending on what polls you look at, will say that Iowan Republicans are voting for Trump more so than I guess ever before, despite all of this. 70, in fact, 70%, forgive me, 70% believe of Iowan Republicans believe that the election was stolen here in 2024. What does that tell you?
Well, Julian, I think we also have to look at Iowa in a much larger context. We're talking about a state made up of 3.1 million people. Of that 3.1 million people, only 100,000 people actually came out to caucus in that election last night. So that's actually about 3% of the total population of Iowa. And we have to remember, if we go back to the 2020 election, you had over 150 million votes cast in that election. So what Donald Trump basically did last night was he held serve, but also we have to remember nearly 50% of the vote didn't actually go to Donald Trump. Nearly 50% of the vote actually went to someone else. So while Donald Trump had a very, very, very good night, there's still a large subset of that small population that actually did not go to Donald Trump, which means there's the potential for that vote to go elsewhere in the general election.
Here's the thing that I've talked about so often, and some politicians on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, talked about in another format that I have, is that the fringes control the conversation. Now, you bring up some very interesting numbers in terms of the amount of people that came out, 3%. Normally in the primaries, despite the weather, a small amount of Americans come out to vote in the primaries, and the primaries are perhaps the most important component of this because the politicians are really clamoring for those votes so they can get nominated, so they can get into power. They can't do it without the primaries. What is it about the primaries where Americans do not value the primaries and do not come out to vote?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the reason why we may not see a level of intensity during primaries that we may see in the general election is because oftentimes they may be a foregone conclusion. And they come down to money, organization, and overall infrastructure. And so one word that I think we need to leave viewers with today is the word firewall. If you go back to 2020, we saw that South Carolina was Joe Biden's firewall. But not just his firewall in the sense it was an opportunity for him to stop the bleeding. We know he had lost Iowa, New Hampshire, and he had also lost Nevada. But what South Carolina did was it was his firewall in the sense that not only was it a state that he won, but it showed just how strong he was with a very energized base of the Democratic Party, which are Black voters. And so what we saw was not only was it a firewall in that it allowed him to stop the bleeding, but it also turned his campaign around. And we saw him go on to not only win subsequent primaries, but also coalesce the entire Democratic Party around him. And so what we see in this primary season, candidates such as Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis don't have an actual firewall where they can actually stop the bleeding and then figure out a way to coalesce voters around them. Nikki Haley is using New Hampshire as a state where she thinks she can compete. But even if she were to win, I would say it would look more or less like John McCain of 2000, where he won New Hampshire, but then went on to continue to lose every other subsequent primary after that. And so the issue, again, to your question, comes back to energy. And right now, all the energy is with Donald Trump, not with these other candidates.
So as we move forward here, and those are jockeying for second place, what is your thinking about the game plan that they are putting out here? Are they running just for second place to, say, for instance, get a cabinet position? Are they running for second place, say, just to just be in the race for whatever reason, maybe hoping and praying that Donald Trump, not saying that they want him to be convicted, that'll give them a chance to, run for the presidency. What does this mean for them?
Well, what we see right now is, and I think this was something that was pretty startlingly clear when this contest began. And Donald Trump, at least on the Republican side, has always been the 800-pound gorilla. And so when you say, what is it that they're running for? Ron DeSantis today is actually not going to New Hampshire, where we know that vote is actually going to take place next week. He's actually going to South Carolina. And so you have to ask the question, why is he going to South Carolina where he got shellacked in Iowa, and he's not even going to compete in New Hampshire? So what do you gain by going to South Carolina, where Donald Trump is still going to continue to look like he's on a path, a glide path to the nomination? The same with Nikki Haley, because what we have seen from both of these candidates is neither one have actually come up with a clear strategy as to how to confront and best Donald Trump. Second place was never going to be enough. But what we see from both of these candidates is there was never, and nor is there even now, a clear strategy on how to confront and best Donald Trump in these contests.
Interesting. Moving forward here, in terms of looking at the general election, none of this really means anything in terms of even polls that are out there right now on who might win. A lot of pollsters have this, as a very tight race, but we still really don't know that at this point because so much could happen, especially with Donald Trump's woes right now, with a 36 to 38% base that Trump has. I guess for him, the issue would be independence. And maybe those people who might not want to vote for him, Republicans, since he's the nominee, and maybe vote for Biden, or just may not vote at all. Where are we going with this in terms of, because there's so much hype and hysteria over, well, who might win at this point? It's so early. We're still 11 months out. What can we glean from this, if anything, at this point right now?
That's a really good question. And I would say, again, what we can glean from this, and the big takeaway, at least from last night, that I think is going to play out through this nominating contest, is independence. What we are seeing is Nikki Haley is doing very well with independent voters. She did well with independent voters last night in Iowa. She's going to do very, very well with independent voters in New Hampshire. And what that speaks to is, while Donald Trump has certainly coalesced the Republican and the conservative base of the party around him, it's those independents that actually determine general election outcomes. And what we are seeing right now is those independent voters who will ultimately decide this contest, they are not with Donald Trump.
Interesting. All right. Interesting stuff here. A lot to look forward to. I'm sure there's going to be many twists and turns throughout all this. And of course, Eric Ham and I, Julian Phillips, will be with you to give you all the updates and what you need to know as we move forward. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you shortly.